and he left all three children equal shares of the business. No one wants to say they have a favorite child.
How long did it take you or the family to find the documents in the yacht?
It was months. Where do you see your business in 2 years without you? At your funeral, do you want your children in a fist fight? They're going to replace your desires with their own. Honestly, everything that you just mentioned are pretty common. I typically see it a lot of times with business owners. So they have in mind how they'd like to leave their business in terms of ownership. I had a case where a gentleman had three children and he left all three children equal shares of the business. But there was one child that was the primary, his right hand, who really had a handle on the business. And so he left we were able to address the technical aspect of ownership, but he really left no guidance on the governance of his actual business, and that created some issues for sure.
What is the issue that created for the family?
Honestly, it left those who really had no aspect of how the business should be run with a lot of say so, a lot of voting power, giving them the right to have just as much input as the one who had been there helping the father build it up for years. Created some frustration for the older sibling who felt like at the very least, even if there were equal ownership, that he should have more right to how the business is ran because he hadn't been there.
Would you say that was something that was missed in the planning process, or was it the business owner maybe didn't want to think about that uncomfortable part of the decision making process?
Absolutely. I think sometimes there are these difficult decisions that have to be made. No one wants to say they have a favorite child. I have two myself, a boy and a girl. I'm able to realize at a very young age, they have their different strengths. And so, while I don't have a favorite either, I think it's important to know, especially in regards to something like running your business, if one is more suited for that responsibility and how you should delegate that in accordance with your trust and overall estate planning. Something that's also pretty important is where you keep these documents. For instance, my wife knows specifically where anytime I make an update or anytime we have key documents where they're located. So at least one other person knows. I recall one case where we had the most challenging time trying to figure out where his estate planning documents were. We all were aware that he had them drawn up, but they were actually in his yacht. So it took us well into the probate process to find out that there was actually a will, a trust, all these things perfectly executed, but hard for anyone to honor them if we don't have it.
How long did it take you or the family to find the documents in the yacht?
It was months. It was months. I can't even tell you. And I think it was like the wife was like going to just like have lunch on the yacht. I don't think she was even taking it out. I think it must have just occurred to her, like, "Oh yeah, let me check to see what we have
Wow.
in here."
So was the estate sort of on pause during that time period? Was everything kind of frozen?
Well, she had access to several accounts that were joint. So a lot of like she was able to take care of certain things, but the like for instance the slip that the yacht was like the cost of that was coming out of the estate. So for the most part, yeah, a lot of things were on hold as we were trying to locate these documents because we were all everyone involved was aware that documents had been drawn up, and so it just took us a while to find them.
So worst case scenario, hypothetically, if this lady hadn't had the joint accounts, or maybe there wasn't enough money in those accounts to just run the basics of her life, she could have been in a real situation without.
Absolutely. I've seen people being fair, like in pretty tough binds because there's one breadwinner who, runs all the family finances, and then that person is removed. And now the rest of the family really is in limbo until they have access to those accounts and the different things. Um, And here in Florida, like, it can take a year just to get to the probate process. So that can be pretty challenging.
What's your best advice for how people should think about that aspect?
So if we're specifically talking to business owners, I typically ask the question is, where do you see your business in 2 years without you
Yeah.
at that? And so I really try to ask follow-up questions to drive home who's in charge, what's the vision that they have, and then I typically ask, do you think both of your or all of your children are capable of or seeing that vision through? And then I ask who you think is more capable. Again, a challenging question to ask, but I think once we get that, I'm able to then make some recommendations on how we structure it. Again, in that previous case, something as simple as hey, equal ownership rights. Maybe it's if there's three children, maybe we do 34, 33, 33, and give that 1% that the one who's been there that extra bit of ownership and more voting power. And understand the different liquidity rights and how compensation is structured. It would have been, I think, a more ideal situation for sure.
How does the business owner communicate that in a way to avoid conflict between those siblings later?
Yeah, so that can be challenging if they all have that desire to be within the business, but sometimes you may get out who has no desire for the actual logistics. They simply just want to make sure that they feel like they're included in the estate. But usually, when it's time to have those conversations, I usually offer the family a large gathering where it's more of a discussion about the estate plan.
Okay, that's kind of amazing. So you get the whole family together?
I have at times, yeah. I really like that because it takes out the guessing game and it
Yeah.
takes out the surprise. It takes out that sting, the worst side of estate planning, which is not planning. I can be blunt at times, and usually that bluntness is just sharing stories that I have experienced for those who have not planned. And that usually encourages someone to have some portion of this conversation. Maybe we don't fully flush it out, but it usually gets the ball rolling. It usually gets us to some point where we can really think through about the future. I think it's extremely difficult for those business owners that are older who have built this thing up. It's their kid, it's their probably their first child. And it's hard to give that up. So a lot of times I meet them and they're still in the accumulation stage. They're still thinking about building and expanding regardless of their age. So that succession conversation is actually a difficult one. And so I've told some stories of those who failed to plan and what of a nightmare it created for their family. And I asked, at your funeral, do you want your children in a fist fight because of their differences, because of something that you could have addressed? Ultimately, if your words are reflected in this trust, a lot of times I've seen people accept it a lot easier than when it's not said.
What are some stories that come to mind of the things that went wrong after poor planning or lack of planning?
I remember simply just catching one of the siblings because the other sibling was, with some of the family members. And it was like, well, why are you talking to him? Like, you need to be talking to me. And I was like, like sorry here, like just happened to be having a conversation with him. And again, knew, I knew of and had conversations with both of them at different points. And unfortunately, not about this, not about the actual what if your father isn't here. Now, I had several conversations with the father about estate planning. It was more of a we'll get to it. And it was just something that he neglected to do. And again, life isn't promised. Next year isn't promised. So we found ourselves where the two brothers got into a bit of a scuffle, kind of in front of my eyes. And I'm just here paying my respects to a valued client. And
Yeah.
I just didn't expect to be in between or have to break up this like these two brothers during this time. So it was difficult. It was definitely challenging. Unfortunately, I do think that was the result of him not communicating his wishes. Writing down your desires is valuable. Ultimately, I think people respect what you wanted if you gave any indication that that's what you wanted. Otherwise, they're going to replace your desires with their own and their own individual ambitions. And even sometimes if you grow up in the same house, you have two different perspectives. You have two different upbringings at times. I noticed that like there's been cases where, let's say the patriarch of the family, like the family structure once had a version of them that was poor, that was growing, that was developing, and the older child knows that version of the family. And then once wealth became more, a part of their lifestyle, there's the younger, sometimes called more entitled, but they're usually the younger,
Different experience.
and they have completely two different experience. One has more like work ethic, one is, has their own desires. And so it that can create just two different people wanting two different things. And if you don't tell them what you wanted, they're gonna again substitute your desires with them.